In America's century-long romance with the automobile, the passion has never burned brighter than with hot rods. Be they immaculate show cars, gritty racers, or somewhere in between, hot rods embody the core values that made this country great. Innovation, competition, improvisation, good looks, fast cars, and the relentless drive to succeed. As told by the legends, old and new, who lived it. This is the incredible true story of an American icon, the hot rod. Hello, I'm Chip Foose. After World War II, Southern California saw an explosion of interest in hot rodding. Guys were racing on the street, but more and more were taking their hop-ups out to the dry lake beds in search of true flat-out speed, unknowingly building the foundation of an iconic American subculture and a multi-billion-dollar industry. Californians have been racing their hot rods on the streets and the dry lakes since the 1920s. World War II put a temporary stop to that, but even the interruption of the war sowed the seeds for rodding's renaissance.
Well, right after World War II, you had a whole lot of people who had done their time in the service and were being let out in Southern California and elsewhere, but a lot of people who were discharged in Southern California stayed here and found jobs here. And those were people who had acquired skills in the military that they would transfer to the hopping up of their own cars. They had learned a great deal about engineering, they had learned a great deal about auto repair, a great deal about aerodynamics, and a lot of other things that they could apply to making their own cars go faster.
SoCal, Southern California, was the absolute genesis and hub of hot rodding. It really grew after the war when the boys came back with all this newfound technology. And it just seemed like they all brought it to Southern California. The aircraft, so much of the aircraft was built here. So much of the brain trust of early hot rodding was in Southern California. And the guys on the East Coast, all they could do is dream about coming west someday. All the cool speed equipment was based right here in Southern California. Plus we had the weather, plus we had the dry lakes. It's all here. It was Southern California.
I mean, everybody wanted to go fast. The guys that came out of World War II, you can't be the pilot at 21 or 22 years old and come back and just go work in a bomber factory in Burbank. Just not going to happen. So there was a need for speed, and this was the quickest way to it, and it became competitive because I think the guys that are in it are competitive. Doesn't matter whether you're racing or you're trying to win, you know, America's Most Beautiful Roadster or the Riddler Award. The competition is what drives an awful lot of it.
It was hard to buy a new car in 1946 because they were in very short supply. They hadn't been making cars since '42. So if you wanted a cool car, you had your money saved up, maybe you had combat pay, and you really had some money. The notion of buying a pre-war car and stripping it to its bare essentials was pretty commonplace in LA and San Diego, all up and down the coast.
While the dry lakes offered a safer and more amenable environment for high-speed hot rods, most racing was still done on the streets.
A lot of these folks would find a street late at night that wasn't being used and just have speed contests up and down until the cops caught them and they would disperse. And then they would go somewhere else later and do it again. They didn't earn themselves a very good reputation.
Because we all broke laws, you know, in driving and building the cars. You know, it's supposed to have, you know, certain heights, your headlights certain heights, and your windshield a certain height. And, you know, we just did anything we wanted. Right away, we got a bad reputation.
I'm not sure if the bad image that hot rodders got at one time was as bad with the general public as the Los Angeles Times made it out to be. Hot rods made a lot of noise, and kids would street race and stuff, but they were usually out in the boondocks where nobody could hear them. There was just a lot of bad publicity, and I'm not sure they deserved it. You know, yes, they were street racing, but as I said, most of it was on Sepulveda Boulevard, which was miles out in the valley, or Lincoln Boulevard, nobody lived around.
After World War II, street racing was more than just competition. It was a rite of passage for young men all over Southern California. Put simply, all the cool kids were doing it.
Street race? Are you kidding me?
Did I ever do an illegal thing? Let me think. I probably did race a couple of times on the street.
Street racing was, you know, the competition of choice. I mean, that's what we did. We did it along Forest Lawn Boulevard.
You go across the Los Angeles River, right by Warner Brothers. The cops weren't hanging around there.
We did it on Larchmont in the Hollywood area.
You'd start at 3rd Street and you'd go north on Larchmont all the way down to Larchmont Village, which was about 3 blocks. It was probably a little bit shy of a quarter of a mile.
We raced on North Sepulveda.
Set up a quarter mile out on Sepulveda Boulevard near the LA airport.
They were racing on Lincoln Boulevard. And I guess Lincoln made a left turn and my dad didn't quite make it and ended up on this guy's front lawn.
Clark Street in Long Beach, there was a place right out here in San Ana called Miles Square.
We street dragged every weekend in Bakersfield, where the Formosa drag strip is right today.
While most street racing took place well away from innocent bystanders, the potential for disaster was still there, as a hot rodder might not know what's around the next corner.
I beat this guy twice. Wanted to go one more time. We went out on this one road, it was called Frant Road. There was a goddamn boxcar across there, and it was completely blocked off. There was a pole with 4 strands of barbed wire. If I went off the street, I'd have been chopped in half. So the best thing was to either take the back end into the train or drive forward in the train. So just as I got there, I threw it into a broad slide, and I nailed it to the wood and turned around. But after it stopped, I missed the train. But they had to come and take each finger and take it off the steering wheel, because when I held on and got scared so tight that my fingers would not release the steering wheel. That's the breath of death.
Many a night of street racing ended with an encounter with the Los Angeles Police Department. True to their outlaw image, some hot rodders even sought to pit their cars against those of the police.
It's not like today. You wouldn't think of going out and looking to get a police car or motorcycle on your tail. But that's what we did in those days, or our little group did anyway. And we were very seldom ever caught. I can remember one time in West LA, I was going down Sepulveda Boulevard. The cop was chasing us, but you know, I hear him and I see him, and so I just take off. 1 mile or so, he was still there and getting closer, and I just started getting off on side streets then. All of a sudden, I round a corner, and it was a dead-end street. But there was an open garage near the end of the street. So I just cranked it and pulled in the open garage, jumped out and closed the door. And the police come up and looked through the glass, and there's the car, and they took me down to West LA and put me in jail I was there for several days. That's where I learned to smoke.
Despite his time in jail, Tommy Sparks would become one of hot rodding's most accomplished craftsmen. As the owner of a speed shop, builder of drag racing and Bonneville cars, and finally as an award-winning restoration specialist. He, like many of his contemporaries, realized the futility of street racing.
Very quickly, I think people realized that if you wanted to see how fast your car could go, you were pretty crazy to race on the streets. There was a lot of it, but it was dangerous. The newspapers were on top of it. So people like Wally Parks had the right idea with the Southern California Timing Association. Let's go where it's at least safer to run. The spirit of competition, I mean, you had guys who had been in combat. They weren't particularly afraid. In fact, they might even be looking for thrills. These guys were competitive. They had the money. They had the mechanical skill. All they needed was a place to race, and that's what they found.
While the dry lake beds of Southern California were the perfect place for post-war hot rodders to run their cars, conditions were Spartan, with little in the way of amenities for racers or spectators.
The dirt and the wind and everything about it is horrid, except it's just awesome.
You just stood in the dirt for a mile. I mean, people shoulder to shoulder down the course. No, there were no bleachers. We were lucky to have a little timing stand that we had built for the SCTA where the timer could be up on a little stand. That was the only thing we had that was official. We had so many guys running at the lakes that a couple of our guys came up with the idea to hang signals, red, green, amber, 3 rows of signals they got somewhere. Who knows, they might have stolen them all. But they hung those up, and we had 3 lines, which we'd never had before. To try to get all these cars through the traps, it was just a zoo for a long time at the lakes.
When you got there, you'd take the windshields off, the headlights off. Your girlfriends could sleep under the car. You had a sleeping bag. We just slept right on the dry lake. You usually start the racing just a little past daylight because the wind can come up there bad. And it really gets bad. It just shuts things down.
No money for motels. My buddy and I, we slept in this car for 7 years. At times that we were out, we never had money enough to buy a motel. All I had was my Navy blanket that I brought home. We'd get underneath there and 2 crazy Armenians in there, and I'll tell you what, it got warmer than hell.
We didn't go out on the lake proper because there were an awful lot of crazy people running around at night. In fact, one weekend they killed 7 people just running into each other. Then when daylight came, we'd pack up, go over and get in line and go through inspection. And then we'd make usually 2 or 3 runs in a day. And then by 11 or 12 o'clock, it would get so hot and windy that pretty much everybody was done by that time. We could drive home.
Of course, choice of sleeping companion could make a world of difference.
I always had a girl with me and would sleep under the car during the night up there, so that was fun.
But not all women were so seduced by the siren call of a well-tuned flathead.
I think I learned early on fixing up a car to attract a girl that wasn't true at all. They could care less.
Say, you're all right. Most girls have nothing on their minds but dates. They don't even want to fool around with the car. Afraid they might get dirty. Say, would you hold us a minute?
The lack of amenities at the lakes extended to the safety equipment, which ran from slim to none.
We didn't have any fire suits. We didn't have any roll bars. We didn't have any fire extinguishers. SCTA stepped forward and bought probably a dozen crash helmets and loaned them out to the guys to run because we made a rule that you had to have a crash helmet.
In the club that I belonged to, the Low Flyers, we only had 1 helmet, so we'd keep swapping that around every time we'd run.
That was followed shortly by roll bars and other safety things. And I wore a T-shirt. That was my fire suit. I did wear a helmet, and I did have an aircraft surplus seatbelt. That was pretty much it. Safety always came after a tragedy for some reason or other in racing.
While fatalities were surprisingly low given the inherent danger of lakes racing, there were fatalities, and quite a few very close calls. Stu Hilborn, the fuel injection pioneer, whose Streamliner would later become the first Lakester to break the 150-mile-per-hour mark, was lucky to survive a major crash.
The Streamliners are all pretty fast. I just got up to 136 miles an hour. All of a sudden, the thing just suddenly spun in a complete circle. Just instantly, I couldn't save it. Usually when it starts to fishtail, I can kind of nurse it a little bit and keep it from doing anything silly. This was too fast. Anyway, it spun, and in about 10 seconds, the left rear spoke wheel broke. The wheel came off, and I was airborne. Not just up, I was end over end over end, up in the air high. And every time I came down, I landed with the top up. I crunched down as far as I could, but there's no room in that car. So every time I hit the ground, I landed on my back, which later on hurt pretty bad for 5 or 6 flips before it finally stopped. And it fortunately stopped upright. I don't know where the wheel went, but it was gone. It was just a hub. One of the doctors said, "We got some bad news. You've got a broken back."
The potential for disaster only heightened the competitive spirit at the dry lakes. Racers looked to push their cars to the limit, and that meant modifications. For some, it was a simple matter of addition by subtraction.
How could you make this car faster to be a hot rod? And the first thing you did, you jerked the fenders off, you jerked the running board off, you take the bumpers off, you even take the upholstery out to make it lighter.
And this was all about how fast you could go. And they quickly realized a 32 Ford, you know, the car everybody wanted, was like a barn door. So if you wanted to go fast, I mean truly fast, your car had to be purpose-built, had to be a competition car, had to be probably channel with a track nose, had to have the biggest engine you could manage, and it was no longer a street car.
One of the more successful purpose-built cars was Phil Remington's modified Roadster, a project begun before World War II, but not raced until 1946.
Well, I was starting to build a car called a modified, which was like a regular dirt car with a tail, except there was no tail. It was just a small tank right behind the driver, but the front end and the engine and all were similar to a regular sprint car. I finally finished that, and the first time I ran it was at El Mirage. I built myself a tail and put that on. I picked up about 10 miles an hour.
Phil Remington ran the modified Roadster from 1946 to 1948 and set several class records, topping out at 136 miles an hour. Very few people who ran at the dry lakes had one-off cars like Stu Hilborn or Phil Remington. Most guys just wanted to hop up their Roadsters. That's where Alex Exidius and SoCal Speed Shop came into the picture. Shops like SoCal bridged the gap between manufacturers and racers. But Alex Exidius would find that pursuit of customers would put him behind the wheel of one of the most famous one-off Lakesters ever built.
I knew through going to Edelbrock's place and watching and looking that he was starting to make a lot of manifolds and heads. I could see there was going to be a big trend of hot rodding, and I opened the shop, and I was the last guy in the world that should have opened the shop. Nobody knew me. I'd never done anything. I'd gone to the lakes and watched, but never raced.
Alex Exidius started SoCal Speed Shop the day he was discharged from the military. He began with a humble storefront on Olive Boulevard in Burbank, California, later moving to a larger facility in North Hollywood. Business was slow at first, but as word of mouth spread, SoCal Speed Shop became a preferred destination for hot rodders.
What a name for a place to go and buy a cam or something, a speed shop. Because it was all about speed in those days. That guys were working and had jobs and were making money. I really started selling heads and manifolds and Winfield cams and stuff. That's when I decided that it wasn't SoCal Custom Shop, it was SoCal Speed Shop. And I better start speeding. To build another 32 Roadster would have been ridiculous if I wanted to make a name for myself. There were hundreds of those, and they were all going about the same. That's when I thought I was going to build a belly tank.
The SoCal Belly Tank was a great leap forward for dry lakes racing. The body started life as a fuel tank for the P-38 Lightning, which needed the extra fuel to provide aerial support for B-17s on bombing runs over Germany during World War II. Bill Burke, the father of the belly tank, made a prototype out of a 168-gallon tank from a P-51 Mustang, but eventually settled on the larger 305-gallon P-38 tank. Mount the tank on a Model T frame, wedge a 39 Ford V860 engine into the rear, throw on wheels made for a milk truck, and you've got a light, aerodynamic machine built for demolishing the competition. A machine that embodied the core ethos of hot rodding. Cheap, innovative, distinctive, and fast as all hell.
A belly tank would stand out. Plus, they were great-looking cars. It's an Air Force designed teardrop-shaped, perfect streamlined thing, and you could get it in a surplus store after the war for probably 20 bucks. So,
well, it was pretty astounding because the things are so small that you wonder how anybody could even get in the thing, let alone have a full-size flathead in the thing. Well, the hot rodders were pretty innovative. They would start or try anything, given half a chance. I was not competitive with the belly tanks. They just had less frontal area, and I couldn't compete with them.
By the end of the 1948 season, the SoCal Belly Tank held the SCTA Class A record at just over 131 miles per hour and took the Club Points title, and its potential had yet to be fully tapped. In the years to come, the Belly Tank would reach speeds at just under 200 miles per hour. And it was no mean feat to pilot an essentially improvised car over the uneven surface of the dry lakes.
Driving the belly tank was extremely, extremely loud because you were down inside this huge shell of a car, and everything was echoed way beyond what you'd ever heard before. Mostly we heard the rear end gears, mostly. The exhaust were taking the engine out, and in those days a flathead only ran about 5,400 RPM, so they didn't scream like 11,000 like they do now. But we could hear the rear end gear, the Halloran quick change gears. Oh God, they were just screaming. I mean, it was really loud in there. I was always nervous before a run because, you know, you thought about how fast you were going to go. Of course, in those days, that was really fast. I was nervous. I wasn't a speed freak. I did it more for SoCal Speed Shop's name on a car, to build a really good car, a really good-looking car, and to be first.
The SoCal belly tank remains as one of the most significant and eye-catching hot rods of all time, an aluminum-bodied symbol of the days when dry lakes racing was the pinnacle of hot rodding. The lakes soon found themselves eclipsed by other racing venues, but the memory and pursuit of high-speed runs in the middle of nowhere lives on. I'm Chip Foose. Thanks for watching. Next time on American Icon.
It was a brave thing to name a magazine Hot Rod in January of 1948. I said it would be like naming it Gangbanger today.
There was a fear on Wally's part that this whole thing could die almost before it got started because there was tons of bad publicity. You just need to go and look at the old newspapers. Hot Rodder kills Granny in Pasadena or something like that.
We were all running on the street, you know, and C.J. Hart opened a drag strip and we were in heaven, you know.